Matt, shifting the gear to the conflict in Ukraine, Donald Trump, the Trump administration has decided to put, if Russia doesn't accept the peaceful, the so-called peaceful end, as they call it, they would put sanctions on Russia. They're talking about, it seems that the new rhetoric, the new line is that we have to give Ukraine Article 5 guarantees, the
Yeah.
NATO guarantee to Ukraine. Why is that so difficult to understand that a neutral Ukraine, Ukraine without any sort of, military coming from NATO, Europeans, would be prosperous, would be better. They were in the same position before this war started. They can come to the same position in the aftermath of any settlement in Ukraine. And you don't need to go, the whole game, the whole problem in Ukraine is about NATO. And you come again with the case of NATO. I don't see that happening. It seems that we're going to have this war on and on.
It's insane, you know? I mean, you've first of all, you've got two major neutral states in the middle of Europe, Austria and, Switzerland. Up until recently, you have Finland as well as a neutral state. Ukraine had written into its constitution when it left the Soviet Union that it would be a neutral state. These leaders in Europe, as well as Americans as well, because you have a huge chunk of the Republican Party and most of the Democratic Party as well that still views this war as being a righteous war, right? I mean, uh, for them, the idea of Ukrainian neutrality would be defeat. One, it goes against the whole narrative. It goes against this whole narrative that Russia is launching this war because it is an imperial power that's bent on reconstituting the Soviet Union. Hitler, I mean, it's going to be Putin is the next Hitler, right? I mean, so to now have to say, well, that narrative wasn't exactly the case, and we've made peace with these people that for years we have said we can't make peace with. We can't trust them. That's a very difficult thing to do when you essentially put yourself in the corner like that. The idea of neutrality as well means that you've lost a piece of the chessboard, that you've lost a part of the map that's no longer your color. I mean, so you see this thinking again, not just in the affairs of Latin America, not just in the affairs of the Middle East, but, certainly in Europe where it really dominates, where you really have men and women who are, again, disciples of Kissinger and Brzezinski. The uh, view of the Europeans, the European leadership as it is, their inheritance of their role as the lead vassals of the United States. I saw one commentator actually the other day referring to them as, vice powers. The deputy among in the empire, right? And so now losing that status, losing that role, as well as the idea that this was our fiefdom, this is our continent, and now we're losing part of it to those out to another power is just something that they've been inculcated and conditioned to understand as an existential defeat, as a great defeat, as something that they should go to war to. I mean, in the way that they have spoken in the last week in particular, whether it's the Germans, whether it's the French, whether it's the British. You had the head of the British Army or British military the other day say something along the lines how the British people will come to learn what sacrifice really means. I mean, like this dramatic, language, this rhetoric, just this fear mongering that's meant to try and whip the European people into shape in order to prevent what? Ukraine becoming neutral? In order to prevent what? The repetition of the successful neutrality of Austria and Finland during the Cold War? The emulating the success of Swiss and Scandinavian neutrality for very long time. I mean, like that's what we have to, the French general telling the French people, you'll have to have your children die. Whatever ridiculous comment Mertz has made in the last week. I'm sure he made another one today.
We have the British one as well.
Yeah, the British. Well, yeah, like I said, the British, the British people have to learn what sacrifice really is. To paraphrase what he said. So just the fear, right? The desperation, the idea that this war is coming to an end, and this is where we put all of our eggs. This is the proverbial basket of eggs, and we are losing this, and that means a heck of a lot. That means a loss of our political identity. That loss means a loss of our power, not just on the continent, but for these people, the idea of credibility is so important. The Europeans use it the same way the Americans do. If people recall throughout the Iraq War, Afghan War, or whatever, why can't the United States get out of Iraq? Why can't we get out of Afghanistan? Why can't we get out of Syria? Oh, because we'll lose credibility. And the Europeans say the same thing too. The myopia that these people live in, like their limited worldview, the bubble that they're in, is so divorced from the reality of the rest of the world. And again, they're just ensconced, they're entranced with their own belief that they are engaging in the great decisions of history. These are men and women who believe they are men and women of history. They're like Tolstoy's general, right? That without Ursula von der Leyen, there would be no Europe, right? Without Friedrich Merz at this time and period, there would be no rejuvenation, no regeneration, no a strengthening of Germany, right? God knows what Keir Starmer believes he is. Right? So, you put all this together and you're like, okay, you can see how they're doing almost everything that's possible to spoil or sabotage the chance to end this horrible, murderous, unwinnable war. And I agree with you. I mean, I think this thing continues to go on. I mean, I'm not in the camp, as people know, that believe that the Russians are going to wrap this up by March. I think that, you and I are talking about this time next year. God help us, it doesn't escalate, it doesn't expand. You just had Turkey shoot down a drone the other day that was heading towards its territory. The idea that this is going to grow is, yeah, maybe it's not happening in the manner in which we were afraid of 3 years ago, 2 years ago, or even last year, but that doesn't mean that that possibility is not there, right? And you'd be a fool to think that just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't happen. You know, so yeah, I mean, the one thing I guess I will say about all this is that some of the comments that did come out this week do contradict the hysteria of the Europeans. I mean, the comments that Merz, the German chancellor, said the other day about the American proposal, that was really remarkable. The idea that you've got this process that has not been stymied. That it is a back and forth. The Americans talking to the Russians, then to the Ukrainians, back to the Russians. The Europeans are included in this. But I think the reality is that Zelensky went to Berlin this week and said to them, essentially, the jig is up. That, I know that you don't have the wherewithal, that you don't have the bank accounts, you don't have the armament factories, and you don't have the will to win this war for us. And so the reality is the continual degradation of this of my country, continual destruction of its people and its land, and you can't stop that. I think that's what has occurred, that there's an understanding that this war truly is unwinnable, that the Americans are serious about leaving the war. And again, while, a year from now, we could still be talking about it. That means that the Russians have just taken more ground, more Ukrainian infrastructure has been destroyed, more Ukrainians are dead, more Russians are dead. And there is the great risk that the war escalates or expand. All those things remain true. But there also is, too, a chance that there's a collapse, that the Ukrainian government runs out of money, right? And I think that's the major thing, particularly as your Europeans can't seem to come up with a plan to solve Ukraine's budgetary problems without stealing from the Russians, which now you have a number of European countries against, including Italy, because it's one's outright theft, but it also carries great consequences for Europeans from Russian retaliation. So I think this week or over the weekend, beginning this week, this realization really set in that the jig is up, that if we don't take this, where we're going to go from here is going to be worse than the last 4 years we've experienced.
Yeah, actually, The Associated Press reported that the Ukraine is on the verge of bankruptcy.
Hmm.
According to the International Monetary Fund, it will need a total of 137 billion euros in 2026 and 2027.
Yeah.
It's going up and up, and you see the situation in Europe. They're not in a good position right now, and I assume that mostly the most burden is on the shoulders of German people. And who's going to provide this amount of money? I don't see Donald Trump doing this. He,
No,
he,
no. I
he
mean,
wants to gain from Europe. He's not going to give anything to Europe to help the war, the continuation of the war in Ukraine.
no. The only way the Americans are going to put any money into this is if they get money out of it, right? And even then, they don't want to do that. They want to use the Russian assets to establish some type of fund, investment fund that would generate profits. I mean, you go back to the was it 27 point? I can't even remember. 27 point peace plan,
28
28,
point.
28 point
28.
peace plan.
Yeah.
I think we're at 20 now. But like, the 20 that one of those points was that there would be $100 billion taken from the Russian frozen assets, put into an investment fund, and that the United States would split the profits with the Russians. I mean, that's the American Reconstruction plan for Ukraine, is to profit. We've known this all along. I mean, it was in the first year of the war, so that the CEOs of BlackRock and other Wall Street vultures and vampire firms were in Ukraine, essentially signing a deal with the Ukrainians that we will take over your reconstruction when the war is on. And I think maybe that was Goldman Sachs that was so prominent in that. But I mean, this has been the case throughout these last nearly 4 years. Is this golden egg that lies at the end of the war of people, taking the spoils, people taking the corpse of Ukraine, and then through the claim, but the euphemisms of investment and reconstruction, looting it for what remains, and then making it essentially a slave, making it a vassal, making it a creature of Western finance. The idea that at the end of this, you're going to have a rebuilding of Ukraine, but it's going to be something that everything always leads back to the banks, particularly the American banks. Yeah, that's the way it was always going to be for the Ukrainians. I mean, there's not been one pathway here where, even if you did have, through some kind of miracle, through some type of Deus ex machina, that the Russians were defeated and Ukraine were to take back all its territory, right? Some type of parallel universe fantasy type arrangement, that the Ukrainians would be at this point, though, where now they've sold themselves to the American banks, that they'd be owned by the American banks. This was always the way it was going to be. And I shouldn't just say American banks, because I know the Europeans were really heavily involved in this. I mean, this is one of the things as well, too. One, you saw the panic in the markets over European defense stocks in the last couple of days. And then CNBC had an article yesterday where, all these European defense firms are putting out public relations statements about how, peace is not the end for us. There'll be restocking benefits and all this other really grotesque, statements from these weapons companies about how even with peace, it's not the. I mean, talking about how peace is the worst possible thing for them, because it is. But so you had this idea, though, I think, in Europe, as it was in the United States too, because up until the Trump administration came in, you had Americans like Mitch McConnell talking about the economic benefits of this war, about how this war was funding American jobs because Americans were the ones building the Patriot missile systems and things like that. And I think you had a degree of Keynesianism here in the European mindset that, okay, this $200 billion, say we're going to steal from the Russians, this 140 billion euro that we need to provide to Ukraine over the next 2 years or else they collapse. Yeah, a lot of that will go to Ukraine, but an awful lot of it stays here. Awful lot of it goes to BAE. An awful lot of it goes to Rheinmetall, right? An awful lot of it will go to Raphael. One of the ones that I saw, one of the companies that had The biggest drop in their stocks in the last couple of days was Saab up in Sweden because they're supposed to sell 150 Gripen fighters to Ukraine or some fantasy. That was never going to happen anyway. But I mean, and this is something, Nima, that I think we talked about whenever Zelensky would come here to the US, his meetings with the CEOs of the American weapons companies. And I have to believe that Zelensky, if he was smart, was saying to those men and women, and they're smart enough to realize it themselves, that if you want the tens and tens of billions of dollars that are back ordered for weapons for Ukraine, as well as the tens and tens of billions of dollars back ordered in the defense buildup, the weapons buildup over the last few years in Europe, you better keep this war going. And this is another reason why neutrality is such a horrible idea for the Europeans and many Americans, because that cuts off that spigot. So if we do have peace in Ukraine, Ukraine does become a neutral nation, there's not those tens and tens of billions of dollars in back orders now is no longer applicable to Ukraine. And now the Europeans have a tough time explaining it other than just continuing this boogeyman fear-mongering about Russia. In the Wall Street Journal, actually, and I'll shut up on this final note. The Wall Street Journal the other day, in an article just about everything we're talking about here, literally the journal, in the middle of its article, says that without the fear-mongering, European politicians can't sell the need for increased defense budgets to their people. So without making their publics irrationally afraid of the Russians, they can't sell all these massive increases in their size of their militaries, their defense budgets, the prominence of their weapons companies, etc.